If you've been on this channel, if you follow our blog, or if you've read our book, Beating the Dementia Monster, you know that I've had an amazing journey with Alzheimer's disease. In 2015, cognitive testing at the University of Washington's Brain Wellness Center classified me as impaired. MRIs in 2017 and 2018 were for someone in memory care. My doctors concluded this was Alzheimer's disease. I couldn't drive a car and had episodes when I couldn't recall my phone number or zip code of 30 years. But in 2021, I had normal MRI and PET scans, while several cognitive tests since 2021 have been consistent with normal aging. Doctors who have examined me or who I've spoken with attribute my improvements to the suite of lifestyle changes I made beginning in 2015. We call them the Dementia Toolkit. What's in the Dementia Toolkit? Let's take a look. Some doctors like to refer to Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes begins with metabolic syndrome, including glucose intolerance. Many researchers and specialists say this may advance from type 2 diabetes to Alzheimer's disease, although this depends on a lot of factors. In glucose intolerance, someone incessantly consuming high carbohydrate foods demands more and more insulin from the pancreas. Those donuts you ate for breakfast now exist in your blood as a form of sugar called glucose. Excess glucose can damage organs, so the insulin is supposed to be prompting cells to suck up the glucose and lower its concentration in the blood. The cells then use the glucose as an energy source. But when you consume more and more carbohydrates, you have more and more glucose and then more and more insulin. It comes to a point where the cells are overwhelmed by the deluge of insulin and stop responding. Then glucose goes out of control and can begin damaging organs. This is insulin resistance. It's a central mechanism in type 2 diabetes, and it plays an important role in Alzheimer's disease, or as we say, type 3 diabetes. Metabolic syndrome is a term we can use to describe all that's going on here. Anything you do to control metabolic syndrome will go a long way toward preventing or controlling both type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's disease. Now, I'm not a doctor or a physiologist, so don't take my word for it, but this is what you will find if you read up on it. We have some links in the show notes below. So, how do you control metabolic syndrome? That's what much of the Dementia Toolkit is intended to do, although it's more than that. The first tool in our toolkit is get exercise. Of course, much of the energy used to work your muscles will come by consuming glucose in the blood, and that will help with metabolic syndrome. But during sustained aerobic exercise, you also produce a protein called the brain derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. This protein has the power to not only repair damaged brain cells, but also to prompt stem cells in the hippocampus to form new brain cells. I've found research where they have actually measured an increase in brain volume following a year of new exercise, so it's very powerful. So, how much exercise do you need to do to make a difference in Alzheimer's disease? Well, unfortunately, a fair amount. According to research published in the journal Alzheimer's and Dementia, the optimal is 6.5 hours per week. For me, if I follow my orthopedist's advice and take one day off during the week, that works out to about 55 minutes per day on the treadmill. But it's the first thing on our agenda every day. In my personal experience, I believe that I was beginning to experience improvement with my disease after a few months of regular, vigorous exercise, but it took more than 6 months before I thought I could drive a car again. And even then, it was probably a little premature. But certainly after a year, I was driving safely. Now, it turns out there's a lot more to this exercise story than the BDNF protein. Recent research on exercise and the brain have found a much bigger array of processes that occur during exercise. These improve brain function and counter the diseases that afflict the brain. Be sure to check out our video, Even More Ways That Exercise Heals the Brain. The second tool in our toolkit is maintaining your social activity. Most Alzheimer's researchers will tell you that exercise is the most important tool. But I met one researcher and practicing neurologist who believes that social activity was your strongest weapon. Most of us have some exposure to people with Alzheimer's, and we've seen that when people withdraw, they may go downhill really fast. According to the Alzheimer's Association, there's a strong correlation between hearing loss and the development of Alzheimer's disease. Why? They believe that it's because hearing loss interferes with social interaction. So something really important is going on in your brain when you just talk to another human being. When I was first diagnosed, I was still working. My care team told me, don't quit your job. Why not? Because work is an important source of social connection for many of us. However, at the time, I was mostly working from home, so that didn't help much. So I decided to retire once and for all, and I became a regular volunteer worker at the food bank. I've been at this now for 8 years. At the food bank, I formed a number of meaningful relationships. I also became an elder in my church, which keeps me working with other humans. The third tool is diet. A number of studies have correlated the Mediterranean diet with a reduced incidence of Alzheimer's disease, but there have been some inconsistencies in study results in that some studies find no real benefit to diet. This has been attributed to people inaccurately reporting what they were eating. But you can't lock people up for years and force them to eat only what's officially in the diet. So you depend on them to tell you what they eat. Do they all tell the truth, especially when it comes to those late night snacks? Maybe not. So there's been some recent work involving testing the blood of study participants that gives us a lot better insight regarding what people actually eat. The blood test can rat you out on those snacks. And it turns out that when you correct for the deviations that appear in the blood test, the Mediterranean diet actually looks pretty good with respect to its influence on brain health. But the Mediterranean diet may not be the last word. There are studies that support the keto diet as an effective tool, but I don't do that and I don't plan to. I do, however, generally adhere to what's called the MIND diet. This diet was developed by the late Dr. Martha Claire Morris of the Rush Institute in Chicago, based on her rather extensive research. Dr. Morris coined the name MIND based on her merger of the Mediterranean and DASH diets, and so it's Mediterranean DASH intervention for neurodegenerative delay. Now, the DASH diet is a modified Mediterranean diet that cardiologists have customized to fight heart disease. When I was first diagnosed, one of the things they said to me was, what's good for the heart is good for the brain. And I've heard that many times since. But Dr. Morris goes one step past the DASH diet after finding a few more diet factors in her research. And you're not going to like them. It takes a pretty hard line on desserts and fried foods, but it also drives out stick margarine, stick butter, cheese, and red meat. Poultry and fish are okay. Use olive oil in place of saturated fats and eat blueberries and strawberries. And what's the worst possible thing to eat? She seems to think it's pizza. But isn't pizza Mediterranean, you ask? She says that pizza served in Italy is entirely different than pizza served in the US. Also, American fast food is loaded with bad stuff, although that's not news to most of us. The good news is that the MIND diet allows for very occasional exceptions. So, has the MIND diet been validated by scientific studies? Well, yes and no. At the time we went to press with Beating the Dementia Monster, there was great anticipation about a definitive study of the diet to demonstrate its effectiveness. But then came COVID, and that messed up everything. They did finally complete the research and publish the results in 2024, but they were unable to demonstrate a benefit for the brain. The research has subsequently come under a lot of criticism, both from the diet supporters and detractors. The detractors would include vegans who don't like the inclusion of poultry and fish, and keto diet people who don't like all the veggies and blueberries. So there were objections to how the study was conducted. One problem was they allowed the study group on the diet to mingle socially with the control group, and they may have compared notes among themselves about what they were eating. Part of the study was to coach the control group on good diet habits, and that learning combined with learning about what the actual test subjects were doing in the study group could have tilted the scales away from a contrast between the groups. In other words, maybe the control group became more like the study group. We should note that all of the study and control group participants were chosen for having poor eating habits and a higher body mass index. So they were all a little porky and they all knew they had room for improvement. Meanwhile, when we were waiting for these definitive study results, researchers published a couple of other peer-reviewed research papers on the mind diet. Some of these seem to have been better controlled and they had more positive results for the mind diet. One interesting thing that showed up in these studies is that the mind diet seems to be more effective for women than for men. This allows me to relax a little while insisting that my wife stick with every detail. Before she passed away, Dr. Morris captured her research and conclusions in her book, Diet for the Mind. Half of the book is devoted to recipes that conform to the diet, so it's quite valuable if you're looking to follow the diet carefully. The next item in the toolkit is fasting. From what I read, a 12-hour fast from your last bite in the evening to your first bite in the day is effective against metabolic syndrome. Your cells have a chance to suck up and burn all the excess glucose in the bloodstream, and they get a rest from being bombarded with insulin all the time. A fast is therefore effective against both type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's disease. However, there's been quite a bit of recent research on more aggressive fasts. We have another video on intermittent fasting, although neither that one nor this one is a tutorial on the subject. There are other YouTube channels that specialize in that, and I recommend the book The Intermittent Fasting Revolution by Dr. Mark P. Mattson. To learn more, you can read that. Dr. Mattson identifies a wide range of benefits to intermittent fasting, including generation of the brain-derived neurotrophic factor that we discussed under exercise. Please note that intermittent fasting is not recommended for the frail elderly, nor for people who have struggled with eating disorders. What I do is a 20-hour fast, sometimes called the warrior diet. Basically, I stick with the mind diet, but I have 2 meals squeezed into a 4-hour window, or maybe it's a 5-hour window. But I've been doing this since early 2020, about 5 years ago. Yes, it was a challenge to get started, but now it's just what I do. For me, a 4-hour window is just wide enough for me to get hungry between the 2 meals. And by the way, don't believe the breakfast food industry when they tell you that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. The next tool is sleep, getting enough good quality sleep. According to some researchers I've listened to, sleep is number 2 in the importance behind exercise. But it depends on who you ask. One of the most widely respected books on the subject is Why We Sleep by Dr. Matthew Walker. You can see him on YouTube and in TED Talks on sleep. Dr. Walker highlights an important discovery about sleep that was only made in 2017, having to do with the phase of sleep we call deep sleep. In this phase, your body is paralyzed, your body temperature drops, and you don't dream. Your brain waves slow way down and sort of pulse through the bloodstream, or at least that's how I visualize it. At the same time, the neurons all contract, greatly expanding the volume of cerebrospinal fluid between them. The changing volume combined with the pulsing in the blood flow creates circulation of cerebrospinal fluid within the brain. In other videos, we've discussed what's called the blood-brain barrier, which limits what nutrients, pathogens, and other proteins that can pass in and out of the bloodstream in the brain. This isolates the brain from a lot of bad stuff that can come in, but it also limits how the body can remove trash composed of larger molecules in the brain. Some of that trash is microtubule tangles, which are a consequence of Alzheimer's disease. Apparently, the tangles can contribute to the spread of the disease within the brain, so it's important to get them out. Circulation of cerebrospinal fluid sweeps up the trash and carries it to the periphery of the brain. At the periphery, there's an interface with the lymphatic system that accepts the waste and removes it from the brain altogether. The researchers who discovered this process named it the lymphatic system. The consequence of this behavior is that deep sleep is vitally important to preventing the development of Alzheimer's disease and to dealing with it when it has begun. But there's a problem, or a couple of problems. Not everyone wants to devote the necessary amount of time to sleep, especially when they're young. They want to stay up late, but then they spring out of bed early, load up on caffeine, and attack the day. Over time, their brains pay a price. And then our brains atrophy as a part of normal aging. Dr. Walker points out that the part of your brain that controls your sleep atrophies and functions less well as you get older. Insomnia becomes an increasingly difficult challenge in older adults. But Alzheimer's disease accelerates the process of atrophy and makes the insomnia much worse. So it's a vicious cycle. Following recommended practices of good sleep hygiene from the Sleep Foundation, when I wake up at night, often around 2 a.m., I get out of bed and do something. After about an hour, I go back to bed and am usually able to sleep more. I use a Fitbit to track my sleep, and I try not to give up for the night before I've had a total of 6.5 hours. If I went to bed at 10, it could be 8 a.m. before I give up. For me, after a cumulative 6.5 hours, I can't sleep at all. This seems to be the best I can do. Our next tool is stress reduction. What's with stress? You may have heard of the stress hormone cortisol. Cortisol is released when you're under stress, and it's supposed to help you deal with situations involving fight or flight. But in situations not involving imminent violence, the cortisol will end up affecting you in different ways. Especially when the levels of cortisol in the body remain elevated for longer periods of time, it starts to attack the hippocampus of the brain. The hippocampus is vital to memory, and it's ground zero for Alzheimer's disease. I'm not sure anyone thinks it can actually be a cause of Alzheimer's disease, but it seems to aggravate it and interfere with processes defending you from it. On the other hand, if you're like me, boredom creates stress. So it's best to have a routine of regular activities, but not ones that will cause you stress. When I was first diagnosed, the advice I got from my care team was to reduce stress, but not to eliminate it. The next tool in the toolkit is learning new things. This is a popular concept, but it's low on our list for good reason. Researchers who study Alzheimer's disease say that playing a lot of Sudoku and doing crossword puzzles may make you better at Sudoku and crossword puzzles, but research seems to show that these don't translate into other strengths in memory and cognition. I read where one researcher said, people should just put down their crossword puzzles and go to the gym. There are some who believe that learning a new language may be uniquely helpful. However, I studied Spanish intensely beginning from pretty much zero on my 55th birthday, and through my diagnosis at 65, even teaching a high school biology class in Spanish. I don't believe in my case that it helped at all. The last tool we'll look at is avoidance of falls and other accidents. I've seen several research papers that correlated traumatic brain injury with the development of Alzheimer's disease. My neighbor, an elderly woman living alone, fell in her bathroom and injured her brain. I don't know if she developed Alzheimer's disease per se, but she definitely developed dementia over the next few years and then passed away. So I don't go up on my roof anymore to put up Christmas lights. That's our dementia toolkit. These are the things I do that I believe have contributed to my amazing success in at least delaying the progress of my disease. The toolkit implements what we call the multi-domain approach, attacking the disease on multiple fronts because the disease is attacking multiple parts of the brain. So thanks for watching. We have a few reference links in the show notes to explain the sources I used to develop this material. If you found this interesting or helpful, be sure to give this a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Have a great day.